At 3:47 a.m. Tehran time, the first American cruise missile crossed into Iranian airspace. This was not a warning shot. This was not a limited strike designed to send a message. This was the opening sequence of a coordinated attack that targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, its missile production centers, and the command bunkers where the Revolutionary Guard coordinates proxy operations across 5 countries. The Iranian regime had been given no advance notice. The strike packages were already airborne before the first radar operator in Tehran understood what he was seeing on his screen. Within 90 seconds, air raid sirens wailed across the capital. Within 4 minutes, secondary explosions confirmed direct hits on facilities the world was told were civilian infrastructure. This is Michael Grant, and you are watching my channel, Michael Grant. What unfolded in those first 7 minutes did not just alter the trajectory of one conflict. It set in motion a sequence of forced responses that no government involved can now reverse. Before we examine the chain reaction this strike triggered, I need you to understand something critical. If you value analysis that tracks how systems fail rather than how politicians spin failure, subscribe to my channel, Michael Grant, right now. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your assessment of what happens next. Share this video with anyone trying to understand not just what occurred, but what must occur as a result. This is not speculation. This is process analysis. Now let us continue. The strike itself was surgical in execution. Satellite feeds from the first 12 minutes show impact craters consistent with GBU-31 bunker penetrators, weapons designed to destroy hardened underground facilities. The Natanz enrichment complex, buried 40 meters beneath reinforced concrete, took at least 4 direct hits. The Fordo site, carved into a mountain and thought to be untouchable, registered seismic activity consistent with internal detonation. These were not misses. These were not near misses. These were penetrations that severed Iran's path to weapons-grade uranium at the exact moment enrichment had reportedly crossed the threshold Western intelligence considered irreversible. But targeting the nuclear program was only the first layer. The second wave hit production facilities for the Shahed drone, the weapon Iran has supplied to Russia by the thousands. The Parchin military complex, where advanced missile systems are assembled, was struck so precisely that Iranian officials did not attempt to deny the damage. They simply stopped issuing statements. The silence from Tehran's military command in those initial hours was not strategic restraint. It was paralysis. Every communication node they relied on to coordinate a response had been severed before the first bomb fell. Here is what this means in operational terms. The United States did not disable one facility. It removed Iran's ability to rebuild what was destroyed. The strikes targeted not just production lines, but the supply chains feeding those lines. Machine shops that fabricate precision parts for centrifuges were hit. Storage depots holding raw materials for missile propellant were destroyed. The transportation hubs that move components from factories to assembly sites were rendered inoperable. Iran did not lose a weapons program. Iran lost the industrial capacity to reconstitute that program without foreign assistance. And the nations capable of providing that assistance are now forced into a decision they cannot avoid making. Russia was the first to respond, not with words but with action. Within 6 hours of the American strike, Russian transport aircraft began landing at Khmeimim Air Base in Syria. Satellite imagery confirms the deployment of S-400 air defense batteries to positions along the Syrian coast, positions that provide coverage over the eastern Mediterranean and northern Iraq. This was not a symbolic gesture. Russia just extended its air defense umbrella to protect the logistical corridor connecting Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Moscow did not ask permission. Moscow did not issue warnings. Moscow moved hardware into position and dared the United States to challenge it. China's response was quieter, but no less consequential. The People's Liberation Army Navy dispatched 3 warships from the South China Sea toward the Persian Gulf under the stated purpose of protecting Chinese commercial interests. But these were not cargo escorts. These were Type 055 destroyers, the most advanced surface combatants in China's fleet, equipped with long-range anti-ship missiles and integrated air defense systems. China just positioned itself to monitor and potentially interfere with American naval operations in waters the U.S. Fifth Fleet has controlled without challenge for decades. Beijing did not announce this as a confrontation. Beijing framed it as routine. But the message was received in every operations center from Bahrain to Washington. The United States no longer operates in the Persian Gulf without Chinese observation and potential intervention. Iran's retaliation began exactly where analysts predicted it would begin, and exactly where the United States cannot fully defend against it. At 11:23 p.m. local time, 48 hours after the American strike, a swarm of anti-ship missiles launched from mobile platforms along Iran's southern coast. The targets were not American warships. The targets were commercial tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. 3 vessels were hit. 2 sustained damage severe enough to require towing. One, a Liberian-flagged crude carrier hauling 2 million barrels of Saudi oil to Asian markets, is currently on fire and listing in international waters. The crew abandoned ship. No rescue operation has been announced because no nation wants to send assets into a corridor that has just become a free fire zone. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20% of global oil traffic. That is not an approximate figure. That is the physical bottleneck through which 30% of all seaborne traded petroleum must pass to reach buyers. Iran did not close the strait. Iran did not need to close the strait. Iran demonstrated that any vessel entering that waterway is now a legitimate target in a conflict that no longer distinguishes between military and commercial shipping. Insurance underwriters responded within hours. Premiums for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz increased by 800%. Shipping companies began rerouting. The spot price of Brent crude oil surged past $130 per barrel before markets closed. That price is not reflecting temporary disruption. That price is reflecting the market's assessment that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer a reliable route and that no alternative route exists with sufficient capacity to replace it. The second phase of Iran's response targeted the infrastructure that allows American forces to operate in the region. At dawn on the third day, precision ballistic missiles struck Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest American installation in the Middle East. The base itself was not destroyed. The runway was cratered in 6 locations. Fuel storage tanks were punctured. Hangars housing surveillance aircraft took shrapnel damage. American personnel were in bunkers before impact. Casualties were minimal, but operational capacity was degraded by an estimated 40%. The United States cannot conduct sustained air operations over Iran from a base that requires weeks of repair before it can handle the sortie rates a prolonged campaign demands. Simultaneously, Hezbollah in Lebanon launched over 300 rockets into northern Israel. This was not the largest barrage Hezbollah has ever fired. This was a calibrated strike designed to force Israel into a choice: respond and open a second front, or absorb the attack and signal that deterrence has failed. Israel responded. The Israeli Air Force conducted strikes on Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah fired again. By the end of the 4th day, over 900 rockets had crossed the border. Israeli missile defense intercepted most of them. Most, but not all. Residential areas in Haifa sustained damage. Civilian casualties were reported. Israel's political leadership now faces a domestic population demanding escalation and a military command warning that escalation without American support guarantees a war on 2 fronts that Israel cannot sustain indefinitely. Here is where the sequence accelerates beyond anyone's ability to control it. The United States struck Iran to prevent nuclear breakout. That objective may have been achieved. Iran's enrichment capacity is crippled, but the cost of achieving that objective was the destabilization of the entire regional structure that prevented direct conflict between major powers. Russia is now actively defending Iranian interests in Syria. China is positioning naval assets to monitor American operations. Iran is interdicting commercial shipping in the world's most critical oil choke point. Israel is engaged in active combat with a proxy force that Iran supplies and directs. And none of these actors can de-escalate without appearing weak to domestic audiences that have been told this conflict is existential. The economic consequences are not theoretical. They are measurable and accelerating. Global oil prices above $130 per barrel translate directly into transportation costs that ripple through every supply chain. The cost of shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles increased by 40% in the week following the strike. Retailers dependent on just-in-time inventory are facing stockouts. Manufacturers reliant on components sourced from Asia are halting production lines. Inflation, which central banks had claimed was under control, is about to surge again. Not because of monetary policy, because the physical infrastructure that moves goods around the world has been disrupted by a conflict that shows no sign of resolution. The second-order effects are appearing faster than historical precedent would suggest. Saudi Arabia, which has spent years normalizing relations with Israel and distancing itself from Iran, just announced it will accept Chinese yuan for oil payments. This was not a planned announcement. This was a forced decision triggered by the recognition that American security guarantees are no longer sufficient to protect Gulf shipping lanes. If Saudi Arabia, the anchor of the petrodollar system, begins settling oil transactions in currencies other than the dollar, the demand for dollars in international trade declines. The value of the dollar declines. The cost of servicing American debt increases. The United States loses the ability to print money without immediate inflationary consequences. The United Arab Emirates followed within 24 hours, then Kuwait, then Qatar. These are not symbolic gestures. These are structural shifts in how the global energy market operates. The petrodollar system, which has underpinned American financial dominance for 50 years, is fracturing in real time, not because of a coordinated attack on the dollar, because the United States initiated a military action that forced its own allies to seek alternative security arrangements and alternative currencies to conduct trade in an environment where American protection no longer guarantees safe passage. Now, examine what this means for American military posture. The United States currently has carrier strike groups in the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Western Pacific. That dispersion was sustainable when no peer adversary contested American access to any of those regions. Russia's deployment of air defense systems in Syria now creates an access problem in the eastern Mediterranean. China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean creates a monitoring problem for operations in the Persian Gulf. Iran's anti-ship missile threat makes sustained carrier operations in confined waters a risk calculation that naval commanders are not accustomed to making. The United States does not have additional carrier groups to deploy. The shipyards that build and maintain those carriers are running years behind schedule. The industrial base that produces the munitions those carriers expend in combat has been optimized for efficiency, not wartime production rates. The constraints are not political. The constraints are physical. The United States cannot maintain the operational tempo this conflict demands across 3 theaters simultaneously without exhausting stocks of precision munitions, degrading equipment faster than it can be replaced, and stretching logistics chains to the breaking point. And every day the conflict continues, adversaries are learning how to counter American capabilities. Iran's ballistic missiles struck Al Udeid with accuracy that suggests either improved guidance systems or intelligence on base layout that American planners assumed was protected. Russia's air defense systems in Syria are collecting electronic signatures from American aircraft operating over Iraq. China's destroyers in the Indian Ocean are mapping underwater terrain and testing sensor ranges in waters the U.S. Navy considered uncontested. This is not a stable equilibrium. This is a deteriorating position that forces the United States into progressively narrower options: escalate and risk direct confrontation with Russia or China. Withdraw and signal that American commitments are conditional and that allies must make independent arrangements for their security. Sustain the current level of operations and watch as equipment degrades, munitions deplete, and adversaries probe for weaknesses in a system that is overstretched and under-resourced. Iran understands this. Tehran's strategy is not to defeat American forces in direct combat. Tehran's strategy is to impose costs that exceed the value of the objective America is pursuing. Every tanker attacked in the Strait of Hormuz raises insurance premiums and reroutes shipping. Every rocket Hezbollah fires into Israel forces the Israeli military to expend interceptors that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to destroy threats that cost thousands of dollars to produce. Every day American aircraft operate under threat from Russian air defense systems is a day those aircraft cannot be used elsewhere. Iran is not winning. Iran is making victory unaffordable. The same logic applies to the nuclear question that justified this strike. American intelligence assessed that Iran was months away from weapons-grade enrichment. The strike delayed that timeline, but it did not eliminate the knowledge. It did not eliminate the scientists. It did not eliminate the political will. Iran can rebuild. The question is whether Iran chooses to rebuild covertly with assistance from nations that now have strategic incentives to help. Russia needs Iran as a buffer against Western influence in the Caucasus. China needs Iran as an energy supplier outside the dollar system. North Korea has demonstrated it will sell technology to anyone willing to pay. Iran's path to a nuclear weapon is now more difficult. But Iran's motivation to pursue that weapon has been reinforced by a strike that confirmed the United States will use military force to prevent outcomes it deems unacceptable. Here is the pattern that matters. The United States struck to prevent a threat. The strike created a larger set of threats that require more resources to manage. Managing those threats degrades the capacity to respond to other threats. Adversaries observe this and increase pressure in areas where American capacity is stretched. The cycle accelerates. The options narrow. The costs compound. This is not failure. This is the operational dynamic that occurs when a nation with global commitments and finite resources initiates a conflict that forces multiple adversaries into coordinated response. The economic dimension amplifies this dynamic. The American national debt exceeds $35 trillion. The annual deficit exceeds $2 trillion. The cost of servicing that debt increases as interest rates rise in response to inflation, driven by energy prices that spiked because of a conflict America initiated. The Federal Reserve faces a choice: raise rates to combat inflation and trigger a recession, lower rates to support growth and allow inflation to erode purchasing power, print money to fund increased military spending, and accelerate the loss of confidence in the dollar. There is no option that does not impose costs. The only question is who pays those costs and when. Foreign holders of U.S. Treasury debt are paying attention. China holds over $800 billion in U.S. Treasuries. Japan holds over $1 trillion. If those nations conclude that the dollar's role as reserve currency is eroding, they begin to diversify. They sell treasuries. They buy gold. They buy real assets. The sell pressure on treasuries drives yields higher. Higher yields mean higher borrowing costs for the U.S. government. Higher borrowing costs mean larger deficits. Larger deficits mean more money printing. More money printing means higher inflation. Higher inflation means further loss of confidence in the dollar. The loop closes. The outcome locks in. This is not a prediction. This is a description of forces already in motion. The strike on Iran was the catalyst, but the vulnerability existed before the strike. The debt existed. The overextension existed. The dependence on the dollar system existed. The strike exposed those vulnerabilities to adversaries who are now positioned to exploit them. And the exploitation has already begun. Russia is settling energy transactions with India in rubles and rupees. China is settling trade with Brazil in yuan and reais. The BRICS bloc is discussing a commodity-backed currency to bypass the dollar entirely. These initiatives were theoretical before the strike. They are operational now. The incentive to create dollar alternatives has been amplified by a conflict that demonstrated the United States will use military force to maintain a system that is unsustainable. The question is not whether the dollar system survives. The question is how quickly it fragments and what replaces it. A multipolar currency system where regional powers settle trade in their own currencies eliminates the demand for dollars that allows the United States to run persistent deficits without immediate consequences. A commodity-backed currency issued by a coalition of resource-rich nations shifts pricing power away from financial centers in New York and London to production centers in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. A digital currency controlled by China and integrated into the Belt and Road infrastructure creates an alternative payment system that does not require access to Western financial institutions. All three scenarios are in development. The strike on Iran accelerated their implementation by demonstrating to every nation watching that reliance on a dollar-dominated system exposes them to risks they cannot control. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan not because it prefers yuan. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan because American military power no longer guarantees safe passage through waters. Saudi oil must traverse to reach markets. That is a forced adaptation. That adaptation is irreversible. Now, consider the domestic political dimension. The American public was not prepared for a prolonged conflict in the Middle East. The costs of previous interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan are still visible. The outcome of those interventions is still debated. The justification for this strike was preventing nuclear breakout. But if Iran rebuilds its program with Russian and Chinese assistance, the strike will be seen as a failure that triggered consequences without achieving objectives. If oil prices remain elevated and inflation surges, the strike will be seen as the cause of economic pain that affects every household. If American casualties mount as the conflict expands, the strike will be seen as the beginning of a war that no one wanted and no one knows how to end. Political support for sustained military operations in the Middle East is already fragile. That support erodes further with every consequence that was not part of the initial justification. And adversaries understand this. Iran, Russia, and China are not trying to win quickly. They are trying to make the conflict expensive enough and prolonged enough that American domestic opinion forces a policy shift. That strategy has worked before. It is working now. The chain reaction triggered by the strike on Iran is not containable because the forces driving the reaction are structural. They are not the result of miscalculation. They are the result of a system under stress responding to a shock that exposed every weak point simultaneously. The dollar system is under stress. American military overextension is under stress. Alliance commitments are under stress. Domestic political consensus is under stress. The strike did not create these stresses. The strike revealed them. And now every actor involved is positioned to exploit them. What happens next is not uncertain. What happens next follows from what has already occurred. Russia will continue to support Iran. China will continue to position itself as an alternative to American dominance. Iran will continue to impose costs on American operations and allied interests. Oil prices will remain elevated. Inflation will accelerate. The dollar will weaken. The debt will grow. The capacity to respond will decline. The options will narrow. The costs will compound. This is not a scenario, this is a sequence, and the sequence is now in motion. Subscribe to my channel, Michael Grant, because what follows from this strike will define the next decade of global conflict. The strikes on Iran were not the end of a confrontation. They were the beginning of a chain reaction that no government involved can stop. The question is not whether the reaction continues. The question is what survives when it completes.